Okay, let's see. No, Davies. There's a Packer over there. I wonder. Oh wait, who's this? This is. Oh, Boyd K. Packer, who was put here just about 2 years ago. Let's see. Ah, there it is. This one right here is what I was looking for. And it says right there, Lorenzo Snow. Hey, okay. Well, let me... Oh, hi. You're probably wondering what I'm doing here at the cemetery. And I'll explain that in just a second. But again, we are in Colorado City, and we're continuing to develop a relationship with the ministry that's down there. We're just pleased about that. I thought I'd just take a brief break today because this week we've been thinking a lot about death. Not just because of the shooting in Las Vegas, but also, we ended the passage in Philippians 1 last week talking about how Paul said there would be great purpose from God, not only in his life, but in his death, and that there's even great gain in death. So I wanted to drop just one or two quick passages because they really are quite telling about why it is that we have a different approach to life and death than those who don't know the Lord and don't love him. Let me explain first while I'm here at Lorenzo Snow's monument right behind me. Lorenzo Snow was the fifth president of the LDS Church. He's buried here in Brigham City because he had a large hand in actually developing Brigham City and getting it to be a thriving community in that sense. So that's why he's buried here. He died right after the turn of the last century in 1901. But what had piqued my curiosity is the fact that I was doing some studying, just aimless kind of studying. And I found out that one of his wives, let's see if we can find her. I think she's around over here on the side. I'm looking, I'm like, oh, there she is. Sarah Minnie Jensen right there. Can you see her? Sarah Minnie Jensen. She's interesting. She was the last of his 9 wives. And as the last of his 9 wives, I found out that her youngest daughter actually died at the time as recently as the American Bicentennial in 1976. She died just a few days after the July 4th celebrations in 1976. Her daughter, Sarah Minnie Jensen, died in 1976, which I find just fascinating. And the reason this can work is because Sarah Mae Jensen, who's here on the tombstone, she married Lorenzo Snow when she was quite young. In fact, she was 4 months shy of her 17th birthday. Yeah, she was 16 technically when she married him. She was the last of his 9 wives, and she was 16. And Lorenzo Snow, you're probably asking, how old was he? At the time, Lorenzo married Sarah when he was 57 and she was 16. And then her youngest daughter is the one, Rhea, is the one who grows up, and eventually she dies as recently as 1976, which I just found fascinating. Now, what's interesting when you look at this and you look at so many monuments that are around here, you really can't tell that much information from what's on monuments. At least you can't tell much information about the life that was lived. All you can really tell about is the dates of birth, the dates of death, sometimes the dates of when they die and stuff like that. Here's a lot more. I didn't totally count it, but I think almost all of his 9 wives are mentioned on this monument right here. But the point I want to make is this: is that we can find out so little about the person based on the monuments and the markers that you see in a place like this, because all you get is dates. You don't get anything about what they did in their lives, what the purpose of their life was, what they accomplished. You really only just get 2 dates: birth and death. And when you look at a place like this, it seems as though those dates are relatively random. People die, people are born. When it happens, you yourself have no control over. And yet, from a Christian perspective, it's much more deterministic than that. It has much more purpose involved because, like Paul says in Romans 8, everything works together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. Now that's a fascinating phrase, called according to his purpose, as though it is that he gives us life because he has a purpose for our life and not just because it's random. Now we get that in Philippians 1:20 as Paul's talking about the fact that his death can have purpose as well. But there's some other places that talk about that purpose. It's as though, and this is true biblically, it's as though our arrival and our departure from life are not random, like it looks like on these tombstones. It's not random at all. Actually, for those who love God and who are called according to his purpose, our arrival and our departure are dictated by God's pre-planned purposes for us. Let me read you another passage to give you an idea about this. In Psalm 139, we read this some time ago. He says, and this is from the NIV version, he says, "Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them even came to be." Now listen to that. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them even came to be. So it's as though the writer of Psalm 139 is saying, before we're even born, God has a book, metaphorically speaking, or maybe literally, I'm not sure, but he has a book that says, when you're born, these are the days that you're going to experience before you die. And once you finish those days, you come back. It's not random. God has a purpose. And God knows what he's doing when he brings us here, as well as what he's doing when he takes us away. One of the most startling passages I think I've ever read in my life about this, it seemed to come by accident. And let me give you the context, and I'll finish with this one passage. The context is Acts 13. Paul is on his first missionary journey. He's on this first missionary journey. He finds his way right there in present-day central Turkey. It's actually another town called Antioch, not the Antioch in Syria, because that's where he started his mission trip from. No, it's the Antioch that's in the center of Turkey in an area called Pisidia. So biblical readers call it Antioch of Pisidia, or Pisidian Antioch. Anyway, he gets there. As far as we know, first time in the city since he's come to Jesus. He comes there and he finds a synagogue operating. Let me change hands here for a second. He finds a synagogue operating, a Jewish synagogue in the middle of Turkey, and he decides on the Sabbath to go in and check out the action. It's an easy in for him because he's trained as a Jewish teacher. He knows what he's doing. He goes in, sits down. They have the standard service during the Sabbath. They read the scriptures, pray, and then at the end, in typical tradition, they ask him, "So do you have anything to tell us? Anything to talk to us about?" And of course, Paul's just dying to tell them that the Messiah has come. The Messiah has come. So he decides to do it in a very sensitive Jewish way. He decides to start from the beginning of the history of all of Israel, and he recounts, and this is in Acts 13, he recounts the entire history of Israel in a really wonderful way. And as a precursor, before he gets to the time of Jesus in the current present, man, there's a lot of mosquitoes out here. Last time it was trains, this time it's mosquitoes. I think all the mosquitoes in Brigham City are in the cemetery. Anyway, before he gets to the part about Jesus, he needs to debunk a misunderstanding. And the misunderstanding is that every time many Jews at the time saw a mention of the Messiah in the Old Testament, they presumed often that it was talking about David and not about the Messiah, because there's such a close connection made between the person of the Messiah and Jesus and David, because David's sort of the prototype, in a sense, of the Messiah. Well, Paul decides he needs to debunk some of these because he needs to show them that some of these passages in the Old Testament actually talk about Jesus and not about David. So as he gets to the point where he recounts the history of David, he's talking about David, and that David wasn't eternal. He didn't have an eternal sense, which is what a lot of these passages talk about. And to prove that, he talks about the fact that David actually died, was buried, and was gone, But it's how he, in passing, refers to David that I find just earth-shattering, and it comes back to this idea of having, living basically for the purpose of God and not any longer. And this is what he says. This is in Acts 13:36. So this is Paul addressing the synagogue in Antioch of Pisidia. Acts 13:36. For David, after he had served the purpose of God in his own generation, fell asleep and was laid with his fathers and saw corruption. Did you catch that? For David, after he had served the purpose of God in his own generation, fell asleep and was laid with his fathers. After he served the purpose of God in his own generation. So even Paul is underscoring what we read in Psalm 139 and so many other places, which is this: God is so sovereign over our lives that he brings us here for his purpose. He allows us to stay here as long as his purposes are being done. And then when our purpose list is done, when the last item is checked on his checklist of purposes for why I am here, or you, then he takes us home. And I got to tell you, the bad news is you got to stay here until he checks off the last thing on your list. And until the last thing on his purpose list is checked off for your life, you're still staying here. I know to be away from here is to be with Christ, and that's for gain. That's what Paul is saying. But he's also saying that God is so extraordinarily sovereign that when you look at the dates of people and they look like random days and months and years when people come and go, for those who love God and are called according to his purpose, you're here until your purposes are done. And then you go home to be with him. And that's a marvelous sense of security for me. It means that there is no random accident to my leaving here. It may at the time seem senseless and purposeless, but the point really is the fact is that God has a pre-planned purpose for me to be here, for me and for you. And until you finish the last item on that list, you're stuck here. So as we think about what our lives are about and what death is all about, and how death seems to be always just horribly tragic, and it is in many respects, at least those of us who survive bereft of any kind of time with the person who's left, we do still have to remember that there is a God who's in much greater control of our comings and our goings, that our birth was not random, the actions during our life accomplishing the purposes of God are not random, and when we finish the purposes of God, he treats us with himself by coming home. Great assurance, great assurance. A lot of people die, maybe many of these people died, wondering what life was all about. What was the purpose of life? Why was I even here? And as they're at the edge of leaving this existence, they ask themselves, what was life all about? The good news is, in the Bible, God tells us that for those who love him and who are called according to his purpose, he has extraordinary plans that are laid out before the day we're born and before the beginning of the universe. Not only just for us to love us, but to serve his purposes in our generation. So the question I ask you, and I ask myself all the time, because that's how he stated it in Acts 13, is, am I accomplishing the purposes of God? Well, and you don't have to beat yourself up too much about this, because it turns out that God himself will get you to his purposes without you having to try and second guess him and mind read him and all that kind of stuff. He is so sovereign over all things that when your heart is given to him out of love and out of devotion and out of discipleship, when your heart is given to him, it's easy for him to get you to the places that he wants you to be, so that at the end of your life, you can look back and you can say, I've served the purposes of God, and now God says, I'm done. Mosquito on my hand. Anyway, we'll see you next week. Thanks for putting up with our trips to Colorado City. We're trying to really encourage these folks down there who are doing a wonderfully new work to not be discouraged. It's a very tough ministry place. And to also remember that there's people, even if it's a 5-hour drive away, who love them and are praying for them and encouraging them so that they'll accomplish the purposes of God in their generation in such a tremendously difficult kind of place as Colorado City is. So I sign off now, and I look forward to seeing you next week, and right here next to the grave of Lorenzo Snow. I know, funny way to start and end something like this. I'll see you next week. We are delighted to have life and breath because God has a purpose for having you be here. By the way, it's because it's not all about you. And that's what we hit next week in Philippians 2. How to combat the AAM syndrome. All about me? No. So we'll see you next week. Thanks for watching. Bye.